Namaste, good morning, and welcome everyone to our Fireside chat with Nisha, Anand, and Sudnya, Shroff. And it's really on a subject that's perhaps one of the most important challenges of our times. It's also no coincidence that today happens to be Nelson Mandela's birthday. He'd be 102 years old today. But unfortunately, we also lost two iconic civil rights leaders yesterday. One of the original freedom riders, John Lewis, and Reverend C.T. Vivian, who was a close friend of Dr. King. And both were inspirations to so many, and they challenge us to really remake this country until it can live up to its full promise. Today, it's natural to feel that our nation is a mess with so many catastrophes happening at the same time. There was something about seeing a man's knee on another man's neck that truly woke us up. And it has led, in my opinion, to a national recognition that racism in America is real. And it's not a figment of the imagination of the African American community. Recently I'd read somewhere that we should treat racism like COVID-19. We should all assume that we have it. We may be asymptomatic, but racism is a disease, and we may be the carrier. But the goal is not to destroy the host, but to eradicate and kill the disease. But frankly, when I have these conversations with my two college kids, eradicating this disease sometimes feels like an impossible goal. But then, as Nelson Mandela said so wisely, it always seems impossible until it's done. Now, one important step towards achieving that goal, in my opinion, is to continue to shine the spotlight on this issue. And it's really in that spirit that we have put together this event for all of us today. I hope that it helps us connect with the real pain that's within our society. It helps spark conversations that result in meaningful action and impact. Now, this event is being hosted by the COEP Alumni USA Foundation. And since we have opened up this event to all, I'll just take a moment to first introduce COEP and then our host, Sudnya. Briefly put, COEP, or College of Engineering Pune, my unbiased view, is India's best kept engineering secret. If you have a COEP on your team, you can be assured of success. It's the third oldest engineering college in India, 166 years old, and it's situated in the beautiful city of Pune at the confluence of two rivers, the Mulla and the Muta. It has a rich history, and it's recognized as a cultural, educational, technology, and manufacturing hub. And more importantly, Pune has consistently been a center for social reform in India. So with our roots in Pune, it's no wonder that while COEPians are recognized as entrepreneurs, innovators, and pioneers, we are also at the front lines of cultural and social reform. So just a quick logistics. We really want everyone to participate in this discussion today. So please engage with us through the Q&A window, and we're going to do our best to address as many as we can. With that, I'd like to introduce our host of this chat, Sudnya Shroff. Sudnya is one of our own alumni, a 1995 engineering graduate of the ENTC department. She's a trailblazer, and my impression of Sudnya is that she never does anything half-heartedly. Once she takes up a cause, she's all in. She has worked hands-on alongside migrant and refugee populations across remote Orissa in India, Lesvos in Greece, and in the United States as well. She uses a platform as an artist to raise awareness of prevailing human rights injustices and works passionately to create actionable ways of contributing to their eradication. So Sudnya, welcome, and it's over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I am delighted to introduce to you today community activist, social justice hero, and CEO of Dream Corps, Nisha Anand. Previously, she served as Chief of Staff to CNN commentator Van Jones. She has traveled around the world promoting human rights, and in 1998, she was even arrested for distributing pro-democracy pamphlets in the military dictatorship of Myanmar. Now, at Dream Corps, her work centers around criminal justice reform, tech equity, and green economics. Thank you, Nisha, for making time for our community of COEP alumni, and now even the extended family and friends that have joined us. Your perspective is going to be especially insightful for all of us today because we are a collective group of technologists much like your parents who immigrated to this country as professionally skilled workers and have now become part of the American fabric. We also have an audience from overseas, as we can see from the chat, and I welcome all of you from the varied time zones for tuning in. The parallels of anti-Black racism among South Asians in the American context with the anti-caste and anti-religion prejudice in the Indian context cannot be lost on any one of us. We can apply all the learnings and unlearnings from one to the other, and that's why I thank everyone who has joined in, because this is actually a conversation that goes way beyond just the black and white racism that gets talked about a lot and is getting voiced right now, but to all levels of prejudice and discrimination. We are all here because primarily we recognize that racism is a deplorable injustice, and we also recognize that it is a very, very hard topic to talk about. By its very nature, the ideology of racism is meant to divide, not just between groups of people, but even within our own communities, within our friends, within our families, immediate circles. And I think that is something that each of us is facing at various levels. I want us to take a moment to recognize that by showing up today as a group, we are doing something courageous. We are daring to allow the possibility of feeling a lot of discomfort, even as we uncover our own unconscious biases and blind spots. On the eve of our talk, like Dimple just mentioned, America lost a titan of the civil rights movement. Truly, John Lewis, C.T. Vivian had just passed. John Lewis, who succumbed last night to pancreatic cancer, only the second Black man to be sent to Congress from Georgia, which is actually a home state for Nisha. So Nisha will have a lot of really insightful things to share with us today. He was also affectionately called the conscience of our nation and a man who kept causing good trouble. And I've been called a troublemaker all my life. So I really, really relate to that part of John Lewis's life and take a lot of inspiration from him. So for a man who actually organized the walk on Washington in 1963 that allowed MLK, Martin Luther King, to actually tell the world he had a dream, was a movement that was extremely consequential, even in the context of the South Asian immigration that started post that. And Nisha is going to talk about that. So I'm really excited and grateful that we can pay homage to these amazing leaders as we gather together to talk about a very difficult topic. To begin, just so that we can all sort of get into this same centered pose, Dimple has a quick audience poll that we will start. It's a quick question. Have you personally experienced... Yeah, go ahead, Dimple.
Yeah, go ahead. I've launched the poll, so if everybody can quickly vote. And once you all have done, I'll share the results. Okay. 76% says yes, 24% no.
So it's in some form or the other, it's quite an overwhelming majority of us. It's clear that we at least know what it feels to be discriminated against. The extent will be different. Our lived experiences will be very unique to us, but it's a very intuitive feeling for any human, actually any animal, to know when they are being discriminated against. And that's the fundamental principle of human rights, which is why we care so much about it. So without further ado, I'd like to jump straight into the questions because I really want Nisha to do all the talking. She has so much that she can share with us. So Nisha, thank you once again. And it's lovely, lovely, lovely to have you here. Can you start with your family's immigration story? I think we can all start with jumping in and relating to it right there.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me. And last night, I went to bed with the news of John Lewis, and I could not, I couldn't think of how to have this conversation without talking about him and what he held was his American dream. And I think that was also my parents' dream in coming to this country. My father immigrated here in August of 1969. So of course benefited from the Immigration and Naturalization Act. And he came here looking for something better, something different. He is an engineer also, and came here and got his master's in Boston. And I usually tell the story to talk about the partition when I talk about why I'm here and why I'm still here. And I know that's a story that's in every single one of us attending today. And it's not my story, it's my father's story. He was a baby during the partition and was trapped on the wrong side of that border that was drawn, and wrong for all of us on all different sides of the border. And I grew up hearing the story of him and his siblings in hiding when at some point militias were roaming the streets and looking for people that were hiding Hindus in that area, and he started crying. And I heard the story of how the family, faced with that choice, and my father possibly crying and all of them being found out, they decided that they would sacrifice him if he didn't stop crying. And so my grandmother shook him, and I'm a mom too, so I understand that feeling of shaking him to make him stop, and he stopped just in time. And I've always heard that story about how that moment, it was a mother's love. That was the story I heard growing up. Later in life, and I don't know when it registered for me, but at some point my family started telling me about the family that hid them. The family that risked their lives to save my family's lives was a Muslim family. And they, at one point when their house was being searched, not only did they say, I'm gonna hide my neighbors because I believe that their humanity and their lives are tied with mine, but they also swore on the Quran that they were not hiding anybody in that house when that house was searched. And that is the type of solidarity that I was born from. That kept my father alive as well. The mother's love and that compassion across difference, across hatred. When you were being taught it was okay to hate and to kill people that were different from you, the families could see their shared humanity and saved my family's life. Safely, they crossed the border, and my father was able to immigrate here in 69, and I am the birth of that American dream. I was born here, raised here. I'm sure you can tell from my accent. And a lot of what I did, I'm in good company. Hearing about you as a fellow troublemaker, I certainly had that label and a lot worse growing up. People call me many names. Troublemaker certainly was one of them, because I was able to live here. And
right.
Yeah.
And that's a really powerful story. Something, again, everybody across the board can relate to the partition, because we all have, again, varying levels of stories that have been told to us. But that I can only imagine sticking in your head as such a moment that actually is so transformational in any family's life, right? It defines you and it grounds you. So what was it from the partition time? He was saved, and then did he live in free India, or did he grow up in Pakistan? He moved his family moved to India. Yeah. Okay. And then what brought him to the US? Like, what was his journey? How did he come here?
He's actually in the audience, I think, but his sister came first.
Yeah.
His sister came first, probably shortly after the Immigration and Naturalization Act was formed, and she actually went to school in UC Berkeley, which is where I live now in Berkeley, and then settled in Quebec, in Montreal. So when he first came, he came to Canada and then came down.
Like, what was his journey? How did he come?
And then he moved to Boston to finish grad school and started as an engineer in a company in New York and Connecticut, where I was born. And when I was 2, he moved to Georgia also for a job in engineering. He's a mechanical engineer. And we moved to Georgia, and he started his own company. And at first it was probably like a lot of folks here that moved in that generation. We were packaging up items in our home. He had his best friend in India, also an engineer through school, started a company there. And I like to joke that my dad was the first person that discovered outsourcing, which obviously wasn't true, but it was very true in my life. His best friend in India would make the parts in India and he would sell the parts here in the States, and they worked like that for years.
That's amazing that he moved from New York to Georgia. Like that is a big difference, right? Culturally, even within the United States. Can you expand a little bit on that?
So I grew up in Georgia. I was 2 when we moved there. So I have no recollection of growing up in the North. I grew up in the South, and Atlanta is a very divided city. It is very Black and it is very white. And we benefited from the whiteness, honestly. And I think we're going to talk about this a lot more today. The neighborhood that we were able to move into because we had money was an all-white neighborhood. And there's this one story that it was being built at the same time a country club was being built. And if you could buy a house in that neighborhood, you got automatic membership to that country club.
Right, right.
And it was a white neighborhood, and their assumption was the only people who could afford a home in that neighborhood were white people. They didn't expect Indian immigrants. We were very new. We weren't a concept that was known in Atlanta. And for years, we were the only brown family that was part of that country club, up until very recently. And I don't know on the books, obviously, if there was an explicitly racist policy. It was circumstances. Right. However, you know, it was one of those old Southern country clubs. Women weren't allowed to be members either. It was only, you know, the male householders. And
did you face any explicit racism? Because it's, you know, even Indians, we present ourselves along the whole white to Black shade. Some of us present ourselves whiter than others. Others are, you know, darker skin. While living in the white neighborhood of Georgia, did you know, we can't escape the fact that we are people of color. Even the whitest of the Indians are still relatively colored. So did you face any very explicit, because this is a long time ago, we're not talking about today, it was when you were younger. Did you have to navigate racism anyway in your neighborhood and then your school?
Absolutely. I don't think you have to be spit upon or beaten up to experience explicit racism. Growing up in the South, in a white, wealthy neighborhood, the money was such that I went to a school. I benefited from a school system that was much better funded than schools in the poorer neighborhoods. That was a benefit I experienced because of the history of racism and racist policies. And I also, you know, there's the little things that we all experience. Absolutely. Growing up. What are you? Who are you? People speaking to you slowly because they assume you don't know English. And if you look a certain way, there was all of that racism. But I benefited more from the privilege, white privilege, growing up in Atlanta. And I can say that although we suffer all as people of color in this country, which was built on a legacy of racism, we don't all suffer equally. And anti-Blackness is a different type of racism than anti-Asian racism. They are different. It doesn't mean the suffering isn't there. It's different. And I think you can look at anti-Blackness in India as well. Right. Complexionism is real. Mm-hmm. It existed in us back then. We brought it with us here as well, on a country whose wealth was generated on anti-Blackness. The enslavement of African people from the beginning founding of what is America is what generated wealth for this country. So all of us living here benefit from that privilege. And I know we're going to talk a lot more about that. So
right. Actually, I was just thinking maybe now is a good time to expand a little bit about the model minority myth, because we as a community have played into that whole let's just first, I'll let you explain what is the model myth. Why we as a community of successful South Asian Indians are used to further divide and have us play the racist card against people of color. And how are we playing into the hands of those who want us to play?
Absolutely. I think it's interesting. We should probably talk about policing.
Okay, yeah.
About this conversation as well too.
Yes.
But one of the best examples when I was young, and I used to actually travel the country giving workshops about anti-racism back in the early 90s. And I would talk about this story, and it's so relevant now, which is that when the settler colonialists first came here and had enslaved people, they also had poor white people as well, indentured servants. And
Right.
one of the first things they realized was that poor white people and enslaved people were working together and fighting together and living together because there was such a common bond.
Mhm.
The fear for the power, the property owning white men in this country, the fear was of mutiny.
Mhm.
You cannot hurt and you cannot subjugate and oppress people that much without there being mutiny, and they knew that. And there was a lot of slave rebellions that were actually slave and indentured servants together. And one of the first things they had to do was separate that to keep their power. And indentured servants were some of the first patrollers given that job, given that incentive to patrol and find escaped, runaway, enslaved people, to find escaped slaves and bring them in and put them back into the system of slavery. That divide and conquer tactic has been set up for generations, that if you will subjugate another person, you will get some privilege.
Mhm.
And us coming to this country and believing in the mono minority myth is further that divide and conquer, that you are exceptional and better for some reason.
Mhm.
Just telling us, oh, you're Indian, you have,
You're smart in math. You
sure,
don't get into trouble with the police. You don't steal. You don't. But we are not comparing apples to apples. It's just right.
absolutely. And you buy into that because you're given a carrot is dangled in front of you. If you play along with this idea that you are better than the other, you will get certain privilege. You will get access. That's actually part of the country club story. Go
Right.
ahead and fit in this all white neighborhood and we'll give you access to this group of people. And so
Exclusivity. Mhm.
believing in that model minority myth, believing that we have some better way of being than other people of color in this country, and especially as it relates to anti-Blackness is so important, gives us privileges and gives us an accelerated path to success that it doesn't give anyone else.
Mhm.
That's the divide and conquer. So we don't join together. So we don't rise up.
Right.
I think that is changing right now. There have
Right.
been parts of history where we've joined together and we've moved the country forward in such a beautiful, powerful way. I think that's happening
This
right
is it.
now.
I agree.
Yeah.
So would it be fair to say that the history that was taught to most of us, especially those of us who grew up outside the United States, we had a few sentences about American history that we studied, in the middle of all our
What
relevant
were they?
history. And
How
we were
characterized?
told, yeah, and we were told that slavery ended in 1963 with the Emancipation Proclamation. Is it fair to say that it never really ended? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that people will debate this quite a bit.
Right.
But yeah, in 1865, slavery officially ended. But that was 240 some odd years that America was able to grow wealth and power by having enslaved labor force. The wealth of this country for 247 years, America would not even exist had it not been for that free labor and subjugation of enslaved people. So that was 240 years of slavery, another 100 years before the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed and the 65 Voting Rights Act was passed. So it ended in 1865. We did not pass civil rights legislation until 1965. That's another 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1965, one of the main things you saw in that 100 years was the Jim Crow South, which I would say, yeah, you could not own people anymore. That was outlawed. But you could certainly intimidate. You could kill with impunity. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more, especially around policing and impunity. The stories of, in that 100-year period, are horrific. And just because they aren't as horrific as enslavement, they're almost as horrific. And then the next 100 years that we're living in right now, you saw what happened to George Floyd.
Right. And
that
to so
is
many
an
others.
extension of
Right.
the possibility, that same police force we talked about with indentured servants, that 100 years of intimidation so that Black people in this country could not vote, could not own property, there's no lifting yourself up by the bootstraps during that 100-year period for Black Americans. That extension is still today, where you could watch, not for 1 minute, not for 2 minutes, for almost 9 minutes, someone put their knee on a neck and we saw a modern day lynching. And that has been happening since then.
Right.
And every single time I've watched that happen in my life, 20 years ago, I was actually on the streets in New York when Amadou Diallo was murdered by police officers. There weren't cell phones then at all. He was shot. 41 shots were fired at him while he was reaching for his wallet in front of his home. And every single one of those police officers was acquitted. And that was in my lifetime. And I remember being out on the streets, protesting, following Reverend Al Sharpton 20 years ago. And so I'm faced with that same feeling of failure that a lot of us who have been in this movement for a long time are filled with. Have we done enough? Why hasn't it changed? I'm also filled with that great deal of hope and determination, which I think is what Representative John Lewis embodied, is that every generation we push ourselves to create a world that is better than the last. It is the duty of every human who is in this country and comes to this country. It's part of the deal that is America. I think it's required of our citizenship that we make this country better than it was before. With a history so ugly of the enslavement of African people and the genocide of Native folks, that history, the reality of the founding of this country is so ugly. There's also this beauty of the founding dream of liberty and justice for all, of freedom and dignity, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. These are amazing ideals that we have never fully lived up to. But I believe it is the duty of every person in here, and I think that's the duty, more than fit in and be a great model minority and make a lot of money. I think the duty of America is that dream, to bring us closer to that founding dream of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, liberty and justice for all.
Right.
That's what it means to me to be in this country.
And
that's
really make it apply to all, because the ideas were beautiful and they still hold. They just weren't applicable to everybody. And even the Emancipation Proclamation, it's interesting how you mentioned that it was the poor white people who were made into the first police force to find escaped slaves. The whole concept, the sentence of the Emancipation Proclamation where it says slavery ends today except as crime for punishment, I think that was a compromise Lincoln made in order to get the Emancipation Proclamation to pass, but it was also a big loophole that he gave those who wanted to use the loophole, which probably leads us into the 100 years and now our current 100 years of why American police brutality and the incarceration, the entire privatization of jails, just the whole system, why does it reek of slavery? Like, why are the numbers, you're right. So
it is horrific. This is something I've dedicated my entire adult life and career to, is on criminal justice reform. The 13th Amendment did allow for a bit of a loophole that says if you have been arrested of a crime, you are no longer free. You lose those rights. That's prison. We've all accepted that that's a fine.
Pay for breaking,
People think that's fine. But what it actually means, I think that the over-incarceration started at that point. We've seen tough on crime eras ever since then, and they have been aimed at this has been aimed at the Black community more than anyone else. In the US, just numbers-wise, we have 4%, 6% of the world's population. We have 25% of the world's prisoners.
I know.
That is disproportionate.
Yeah.
1 in 4 African-American men are under some type of criminal justice surveillance, whether it's being in prison, on probation, on parole, and some type of surveillance are part of this criminal justice system.
Right. Even my little town of Los Altos, where we live, just released a report yesterday for our police system. I think our town doesn't even have very few, maybe 1% African-American families. And still there is an overwhelming, the last 3 years records show how skewed the numbers are and how often Blacks and Hispanics were either stopped or arrested or just surveilled. And I've often wondered, because me and my children, we are people of color and we haven't had the same experience. Why is that?
This implicit bias, this type of racism and fear is part of our it's in our blood. I don't know how to explain it better than say we get these signals from a very young age that you should fear the other, that there's something about difference, and it makes you feel good about yourself if you're not as bad as the person next to you. I mean, that's human behavior, right? We all think that we're a little bit better than the other. So I think there's something about implicit bias that we all have to combat.
Right. Right.
Because it's devastating to watch. My son, like most of us, no one can tell what he is. And he's a teenager, and we're in California, he looks Latino. I assume everyone speaks to him in Spanish. He fits the stereotype of somebody that might be up to no good if you see him walking around the street. And so I've actually been able to see a bit of racial profiling for him. He actually, his friend walking home from school, who's a strapping, gorgeous, white, blonde hair, blue eye kid, stole something from the corner store, and my son got banned from life.
Right. See?
Banned for life.
Yeah.
Because he was there. Now my son would never, like, he's terrified of stealing things. He's like, that's not him. And, you know, I've seen those effects growing up here. It's still and this is liberal Berkeley. It still exists.
Right. Right. Your
question, I think, about why is the criminal justice system so targeted towards people of color, I think it's this history of slavery. I think it's the legacy of racism, but that's really hard for people to wrap their minds around. They don't want to say it's true because you're like, well, I've never been arrested, but I can tell you the people in prison for nonviolent drug offenses have done things every single person watching this have done.
Correct.
You could go to an Ivy League school, you could go to MIT, you could go to any college campus right now and find kids in possession of marijuana and drugs. Yep. And if they have a real problem with any of these things, rich families can send their kids to rehab.
Poor families go to jail.
They have to. Right. If you can't pay the money for a good lawyer, they don't even argue your case. You just take a plea deal because that's the easier way, and then you're stuck in jail. So from a young age, you can't pay to get a good lawyer. You get put in the prison system. The prison system does not make people better. There is no rehabilitation in there. If you do not believe me, go visit one. Yeah. It is a mess. People leave worse than when they started. That is backwards. There is no other industry in the world that would get rewarded for putting a product in and making it worse on the outside.
Absolutely.
So people go in, there's no rehabilitation, you get worse. And so even from a young age, you can start this entire life you weren't destined for just because you couldn't pay a fine when you got pulled over and caught with weed in your pocket.
Right.
It sets you up for a life of failure, this system. The entire thing needs to be reformed every step of the way. Our schools, we spend $60,000 to $70,000 to house somebody in prison. We spend on average $11,000 to put a kid through public school.
Right.
Changing the system early on in the education will be a lot easier than having to keep paying money to incarcerate people and take away their freedom.
That is a great segue to the defund. You know, with our current protests and the uprisings around the world, many of us have for the first time seen people demand defunding the police. And that puts a lot of fear, especially in the South Asian community where we are rule followers. We follow rules, and we can't imagine the concept that there would be no police. There is a misunderstanding about the whole term of defunding police. I would love to take this opportunity for us to talk about that so that people have less fear, because we are going to be electing officials in the next 6 months, 3 months actually, it's coming sooner. It's very important to understand what that ask is and how it will eventually go towards fixing what you just mentioned.
Absolutely. I think that the slogan defund the police has sounded to folks like you want to get rid of police.
Right.
I encourage everyone to see what's inside these proposals, especially as they look in your local legislation, because that's not what it is. The question is, what would it take to make policing less needed? Mm-hmm. Our police have been asked to do too much because we've lacked creativity and imagination to deal with a problem we're scared of. We have put more money into police. If you see a homeless person on the street, who do you call? Who's causing problems? Because they probably haven't. You end up calling the police. Does that make any sense? Why can't you call somebody that can help them find a shelter? Why can't you call somebody that will help them get the health services they need? A domestic violence dispute, which all of us would say, if you hear that, call the police. What if we instead called folks who were trained at domestic violence de-escalation and came and dealt with that? What if instead of a kid misbehaving in school, which is now police, you see these videos of folks taking like 10, 12-year-old kids out in handcuffs from school. Why is that a response we have deemed to be acceptable? Because we've lacked the imagination and creativity to think of a better way and the priorities of where our money goes. And so defund the police is about prioritizing money. It's not about getting rid of all of them. I think there are two things to talk about. One, prioritizing money to go to the experts and the services that take care of us and our deep needs, which have been overlooked and not taken care of by the government. I would like more money into mental health services. I would like more money into education, intervention, rehabilitation. I think that our drug rehabilitation centers could be a lot stronger. We have people dying from opioid abuse and addiction, end up in prison to deal with it instead of helping them back to health. The second thing I think defund the police is about, and I loved how you phrased the question actually of we're rule followers. It is about rules. We allowed the police force to develop with impunity. We said, here is a lot of money. Here are military grade weapons and guns that won't be regulated. And we need you to keep the streets safe, which is something we all want. Nobody wants that more than places where communities and streets aren't safe. Keep them safe. And whatever you do, however you keep people safe, don't worry. You won't be held accountable to any rules for it. The rules will be different for you than it is for everyone else. And so we have officers, like what happened in George Floyd's, there have been almost zero convictions of police brutality in the history of this country. Percentage-wise, it doesn't even mark. And yet we know that has happened time and time again. But the rules we've established are that you will never be held accountable if you behave badly. And so part of that defund the police movement is about impunity. What are common sense laws that we can all agree on to hold our police officers accountable to? They have a hard job. I would like to see them with more training and a lot more help in doing the job right. Doing the job in a way that does not hurt, does not harm. I love that idea of serve and protect, right? That's like the slogan of the police. That's what we have to hold them accountable to. You are serving the communities and making them safer. That does not mean killing its citizens. Right. And you are protecting each other. You are protecting communities from violence, and that includes police violence. Right. There is no few bad apples here. Right. This is not a thing of a few bad apples. The whole thing is not working, and that we need to reprioritize the money, and we need to rethink the rules.
So it makes me wonder, is the system working how it was originally designed to work? Because, you know, there were lawmakers who wanted to use the loophole to use police brutality to evolve slavery in its current form, you know, because it ended legally with the Emancipation Proclamation, but there was so much dependence on labor and low cost labor and wealth that came from there. It evolved into this being of, you know, a structure which is, so is it a system that can be rehauled and reformed, or do we need to start from scratch? You know how sometimes it's such a difficult place to be. You just, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I do think it's working as it was designed to. It was to some extent, but it's not living up to the ideals of what we want it to be. I have been a radical activist for my entire life. My parents will tell you I follow happily in the legacy of John Lewis and have been arrested over a dozen times for civil disobedience. John Lewis himself was a student of Gandhi and, of course, was close to King as a student activist. This is a long history of using our voices and our protests and putting our bodies on the line for causes we care about. I come from that school. I also believe that we can make change, that some of the best change we can make and this is from that same school of thought, is by including unlikely allies, the people where we do not expect to have common ground, and finding that common ground. It is hard. But if I were to just say, forget the half of the country that doesn't agree with me about the reforms I want to see in the police force, and I'm going to force my way. Come November, when we vote all Democrats in office, we'll just change this whole thing. Mm-hmm. It doesn't work that way. Those folks who I'm viewing as in opposition to me are still part of this country. Right. What good does it do if I can't bring them along, if I can't change hearts and minds, if we can't work together on some common ground? So I actually believe that the radical throw the whole thing away and start from scratch is important. I think it is beautiful and important because it allows us to reimagine something that we haven't imagined before. Mm-hmm. And what we have now is completely broken. We have to get there. I do believe in the meantime, while we're imagining, I'm somebody that thinks common sense reform, starting tomorrow, we can agree on, and it will save lives. We can ban chokeholds. We can get rid of this qualified immunity clause, which, we definitely research what that means. It's a big problem. I think we can start funding things we actually care about that are in our heart. I think we do that tomorrow. We save lives. We make the country better. And I want to hold on to the radical reimagination, because that's what I think is so beautiful about America, is that you can just dream of a new way of being and try to make it so. This is the greatest experiment of democracy, I think, in the world. And it's not perfect, and it's broken, and it sucks for a whole lot of people. I'm an optimist in that I always think we can do better, but I don't think I'm a naive optimist. I think I'm a determined optimist. And that's who I want to find on every side of the political spectrum, across barriers of race, across barriers of class and gender, to find those other determined optimists, no matter what your political beliefs are, but you want to make this a better country. And I'll work with you on any issue.
I know that across the aisle is possible if we first start at home. I know that I have ideological differences even with my parents. I think they might be on this Zoom link today too. I'm almost wondering, is there something that you could advise, because you've done so much work in finding common ground, and I'm inspired by that, because I find it particularly hard for myself, that when somebody doesn't see the world the way I see it, I'm actively trying to learn how to see the world the way they see it, and then find something where we have a common interest, and then work towards it. Towards that end, I have found that protests and participating in protests, being close to what's happening and people who think like you and not like you, has helped me. But I often get criticized. Oh, you go march, you walk a march, and then you come back, and then what happens? Then it dies down, and things go back to normal. I don't intrinsically believe that, but I feel like you have much more experience in the world of protesting. And can you put that in context or in reference to finding a common ground with those you don't agree with? When you go, you think you are going to be the voice for the voiceless, but I read from Brené Brown that it's more like you're giving ear to the earless. When you go as a group and you make a call that, okay, George Floyd's killing and his murder, this is it. It's like, we can't take it anymore. He's not the first one, and he's not going to be the last one yet, but we need to do something about it. I do believe that the protests help. And it's not only the protests of now, it's what has been going on over the last several centuries. Martin Luther King protested. Everyone, the freedom, the caucus, everyone's been protesting. What do you tell people who are not very supportive of that, and in the process are silent, even though they might actually support what you support?
It is easier to be silent. You can look back on history. I think this is really interesting when folks are like, oh, if I was, part of the anti-colonial struggles, I would have done X, Y, and Z. If I was part of combating Nazism in World War II, I would have done, A, B, and C. If I was part of the civil rights movement, I would have been down and on those buses and lunch counters, and I would have been. We are in that same moment. And what you're doing now is what you would have done then. So I think, first of all, we cannot be silent. I think every great leader that we look up to will tell you that exact same thing. Do not be silent. Find your voice and speak what's true for you. I believe that protest, not just in this country, but of course in India, that has moved the entire world forward. It has always had an important role, and I love that, giving ear to the earless and giving voice to the voiceless. It does change hearts and minds. You cannot erase the picture of John Lewis as a student on that bridge in 1965, on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, fighting for voting rights, which are now being stripped. The Voting Rights Act that passed because of that in 1965, some of those same regulations are being stripped away right now as we speak. But you cannot change that image. And this is actually what I think Gandhian nonviolence and civil disobedience was so good at showing. That image of seeing somebody, a young student, John Lewis, with his backpack on, getting beaten. It is atrocious that we see this, but peacefully, he put his life on the line. And we can look at that now and see that being willing to risk your life for that legacy changes things. I do not want people to feel like they have to risk their lives. I feel like we have a lot of tools now where we do not have to get violently beaten up to make a point. We do not have to go on hunger strike and be ready to die to make a point. I think we can make it in a lot of other ways, but because we're not sacrificing our lives anymore, it's seen as kind of like weak. Oh, what, you're going to kneel during the national anthem? What's that going to change?
Right.
A lot. It changed a lot. It actually did.
And actually, I think that you're perfectly poised to offer us some actionable items. That's what I'm going to ask you. Direct our righteous rage. We all feel the righteous rage in many different ways. Many of us, I know, have walked this time who may not have walked before, have participated. Many of us have become more aware, and it comes to us in different points in our lives. We are all at different stages and phases of our lives as well. And that's what I find powerful, is we don't all have to walk in a protest, but we can all contribute, and there are actionable items, and we all have that righteous rage. We all have the moral outrage. We all feel it. And that's why we are in this conversation together. And we also have family members with whom we disagree. But there's nobody that we disagree who does not fundamentally have something in common with us. And that finding that common something is, I think, where we can begin to take action. So I'm going to leave this part for you to inspire us with, and even share with us what you do in Dream Corps and offer us as technologists primarily. But now that it's open to such a large audience, I know everyone's thirsty to be part. I get people who come and say, tell me what I can do. And I truly don't have answers, but I feel like you are perfectly positioned to give us those answers.
I will give you the answers I have, of course, and I hope that it'll encourage you to look for answers as well. I think the most important thing right now is to realize what you just said. We all have a role to play, and we all can play a role. We sit in very different parts in society, which means we can have very different places of influence to change things. And I think, one, embracing that is really important. Another thing I think is important is to be uncomfortable. These conversations aren't easy. But one of the first things, the organization I run was founded by a civil rights leader, Van Jones. And one of the earliest lessons he gave me was, Nisha, hope that it's your fault. I messed up. It was a really bad error. Actually, I could still debate that. I don't think it was, that bad, but he certainly made a point of, for about a week, we fought about it. And finally, at the end of the week, I said, look, I think that I could have done this better. And he said to me, that's all I wanted you to say. I realized this mistake that happened, 99% of it was your colleague's fault. 1% of it was yours. But I needed you to admit that 1% for us to move on. Mm-hmm. Because if you can admit that 1% where you're at fault, then you can fix it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that that's what we're looking at. A lot of times when we hear racism, we think, well, I'm not part of the KKK. It can't be me.
Right.
I agree. That stuff is terrible. What it looks like is horrible. That isn't me. That isn't you. It's not anyone I come across. But is there a part of racism that is part of all of us? Can we recognize anti-Blackness in ourselves somewhere? I can tell you right here, for me, of course, I grew up in this country. I know it's there and I hate it. But admitting that that is part of who I am, and I run a racial justice organization that fights for Black lives every single day by a Black civil rights leader. But if I can recognize that, then I can change it. Hope it's your fault. I think that's number 2. Hope that something about this is your fault and you can change it. Which leads me to the third thing. Research. If your kid was infected with a rare disease you've never heard about before, you wouldn't all of a sudden be like, but I don't know what to do. Tell me about it. Teach me. What does this mean? You would get on Google. You would call everyone you knew that might have heard about this disease. You would research it in depth until you knew every single in and out of it. And I think that's a piece of US history we can all do. Where does this come from? What is the history of immigrants versus Black folks in this country? Learn those things so you can better understand why it's part of the system that we benefit from. And I think once you realize what a benefit we get from that anti-Blackness, we don't benefit as much as other populations, but we do have a benefit. Our suffering's not equal. Our benefits are not equal.
Right.
But if we can learn that and study it, we can do it. So now for the actual, what you can do is get involved. I think once you have that history, it's my fault. I'm willing to be uncomfortable and say something about it. And I've studied enough to kind of know that this really does exist. Then it's time to take action. And at Dream Corps, we work on criminal justice reform. We pass a lot of laws and legislation. We do it in a bipartisan common ground way to reform the criminal justice system. We passed about 18 bills in the last 2 years, including the largest federal criminal justice reform legislation called the First Step Act. 87 senators passed this law that was then signed by Trump that released in its first year 7,000 people. It impacted 30,000 women behind bars. And since then, we've passed dignity for incarcerated women legislation so that women can no longer be shackled during childbirth in prison. Does this completely transform the criminal justice system? No. But is it something there's common ground and we can do tomorrow? Yes. So that has passed overwhelmingly. And in Georgia itself, unanimous decision to pass dignity for incarcerated women laws. So on criminal justice legislation, what I do is work on changing the laws that have been completely unjust and unequal for a while. We didn't talk at all about climate, and in interest of time, I will pass that, but I believe climate change legislation is also an area for common ground.
Actually, briefly, I think it's worthwhile just putting in a sentence about it, because we do have a population that feels they want to contribute to climate justice, but sometimes not aware how closely it is linked with racism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think all of society's ills can be linked to racism. I think sometimes when we think climate, we think about polar bears and rainforests.
Right.
And, okay, fine, I'll save some money to save wildlife. That's not what happens. A kid in a poor neighborhood, when they wake up and go to school in the morning and they wait for their bus, which takes hours to get to wherever they're going, the transportation, the bridges go over their neighborhoods, polluting their air.
Right.
The power plants here in Berkeley, I have okay air. 20 miles up the road in Richmond is the Chevron refinery, right, polluting the air. And I don't have to tell any of you, you land in big cities in India, you can see what the air is doing in third world countries. It's not just India, it's everywhere. We have clean air here, pretty great because we have these regulations
right,
that you don't have in other countries. It always impacts the community. The communities hit first and worst by pollution are the same ones hit first and worst by poverty. Mm-hmm. All of these plants ends up in the neighborhoods that do not have the economic power to do anything about it. And so clean drinking water, clean air is a racial justice issue. Equitable transportation is a racial justice issue. And those are all linked to our climate and our earth. And
I would encourage our audience, because again, we don't have the time, but this is definitely something that I would encourage all of us to read more about, how closely climate catastrophe and crisis that we are facing right now is tied to systematic institutionalization of racism. That, there have been sacrifice zones that have been created and in order for those sacrifice zones, we've needed disposable people, and disposable people only come from the concept of racism or white ideology, white supremacy. One of the things I'd offer is, we'll probably get links from you in terms of the actionable items that you are talking about, and I'll let you finish it. But then, so that people don't worry about taking notes, we can send an email or something where they could then contribute or participate in the ways that you're suggesting.
Sure, absolutely. I would send an email, and I don't know if you want to look at some of these questions on the panel.
Yes, let's do that for sure. Dimple?
Yes. Oh, sure. Thanks, Sudnya and Nisha. I mean, so it's such an inspiring talk. I mean, I think you both of you spoke from the heart, and that's why it really struck a chord. There are a lot of great questions coming on the panel. So let's tackle a few here. So just give me 1 second. The first one is to do with reparations. There's been a lot of talk about reparations being a good start towards righting the wrong and bringing about some level of equity between between the different races in this country. What are your thoughts? I mean, is this an achievable goal? And would this right the wrong?
I'm for reparations. How to do it, I don't know. I think that even the things that were granted, especially to Native people in this country as well, have been taken away. They've never been realized. This whole 40 acres and a mule that you were supposed to get when slavery was officially ended did not happen. And knowing that it was not that long ago, in a lot of our lifetime, my Van Jones always says this. He says, I'm a 9th generation American, but the first generation born with all my rights. That's his lifetime, because the Voting Rights Act wasn't passed until 1965. So the legacy of slavery and racism is with us today, that I think reparations is a real issue. But I believe that there are individual reparations as well, if you're in a place of power. I think you need to look at the hiring practices in your company. I think you need to look at how wealth is distributed in your communities. I think that there is a lot of things that we don't even think about that are still distributed inequitably. And changing those is also something well within all of our power to do if you're involved in a civic-minded way and locally, and can be done right away. I do not know, I'm not an expert enough on reparations to know what that would look like and how it will be done, but this is the moment when we're trying to reimagine the new world we're going to live in, when we're trying to say what is this next big leap we're going to take in combating racism. That's what we're doing right now. So if there was ever a time to do it and what's possible, I mean, now is it. A lot of our ills exist because we wanted to ignore and pretend like that history of slavery didn't exist. And we turn a blind eye and say, that was them, that was over. And by ignoring it, it's allowed it to continue. So I do think right now we have a good chance at trying to right that wrong. And I'd like to see more done now, while we have most of the country fighting for that as well.
Yeah. And just like you, I'm an eternal optimist as well. And I completely agree with you that, while we should be looking at the big ideal that we all strive towards, we can make meaningful change, as we go along that journey. But there's something about this moment that we are in right now where it feels unique. We feel so desperate right now, and the grief is so raw that I wonder if this is the moment where we'll see a big change, like the kinds of change we saw in moments in our U.S. history. What's your take on that? Do you think this is, this grief can manifest into something really meaningful? It'll happen, or do you feel that we're going to be let down again until the next George Floyd moment happens?
I hope that's not it. I think there was a perfect storm of the shelter in place moment, and this already feel that we are connected more as humans than we knew. The fact that we depended on essential workers to get us through the pandemic, which we thought, like, this is a group of people who have been systemically ignored. We ignored those folks that we are now completely dependent on for survival when the shelter in place happened. So that already there was a turning to see our shared humanity that was unique. And then to watch that lynching on TV, I think we all felt it. You could not have a heart and not feel something in that moment. So I do think something is different than it has been before. I told you 20 years ago, I was on the street for a horrific killing as well, and we didn't change it then. Something feels different, and it's just inside me at lunch. And I hope that that's the case. Something feels different.
Okay.
It will take all of us to keep that momentum going.
Okay, perfect. You want to keep my fingers crossed on that one. There have been a few questions on the role of education, where a lot of people have talked about education being a cure to the problem, so to say. What are your thoughts on it? There is unequal access to education and whatnot, so the path's not easy. The starting lines that different people begin their races with are different. So what's your thought? And particularly, what can we do? Is there things that we as a community can do to help drive a change within education access?
Yes, we have to. I think this is one of the most heartbreaking problems that I see. And you can just go to two different schools, go to a public school in a wealthy neighborhood and then go to a public school in a poor neighborhood, and you will see how very different our education system is from kindergarten and even before that, and access to any education before that, preschool. If you're a parent, an essential worker, and have to work 3 or 4 jobs to make ends meet, to pay the rent, your kid, you are saving all the money to send them to preschool, it's not going to happen. They already start kindergarten at a very unequal place. Closing that education gap is so important. I think of that saying, which someone will have to tell me where it comes from. What's the best way to kill a dragon? And they say when it's in the egg. And I think that's the same thing. When's the best place to solve this education problem? I think it's as early back as you can go. Start at the beginning, because once you set up that uneven playing field from kindergarten, it's really hard to close that gap. And all of our public resources are trying to close that gap, and that's failing everybody because there's not enough money for it. And we're just trying to play catch up their entire lives, trying to play catch up. And our education system, it's not preparing anybody for the future that's coming. We're learning old, outdated ways of learning instead of being innovative and preparing kids for the future that's coming. Teaching resilience and critical thinking skills, learning how to plan and pivot. Those aren't skills that are being taught in our school. My daughter was learning cursive instead of coding. Like, I'd throw away cursive tomorrow if she could actually learn coding in the public schools here. Obviously, that's a better skill to learn. And so I think making it completely, we have to change how it's funded. I told you we had forced busing in Atlanta. I know we're running out of time. I don't want to spend too much time here, but yeah, I agree. It's important. The entire thing has to change, and it can start with reforms in your own neighborhood. I think here I've seen an experiment where the PTAs have been revenue sharing for all of the schools in the area to try to distribute parent-raised funds more equitably among all the schools. There are little things like that you can do, because obviously the richer schools are going to have more money, and they're going to have the money to have computer labs or a PE coach. I know our school was debating if they can even have a PE teacher. If we could think about sharing resources that way, that's an easy thing that can be done.
Just a quick thing, and this is in the American context. For those of our viewers who are outside the United States, the education systems are different. And for me personally, I've realized education is a very broad term. So many of us are educated, but we are not aware. You could go through an entire degree and still not be aware about history or, how. I think that's just something I'm leaving there as a thought because we have so many creative people who are on this conversation, that it's something that we need to think about, is the quality and what do we mean by education. One is skills and training to become, just productive in this world. But the other part of a deeper education is our ideological education, because I think that is something that we can't quantify, but it's actually even more important towards the productivity.
So Sudnya, there have been a couple of questions regarding casteism amongst American Indians and what sort of role it plays. And perhaps that's a topic for a much larger discussion going forward. But if there's something maybe you want to shed some light on, or Nisha, that'd be good.
Nisha?
I think that it's important to know, just because it doesn't look the same and as drastic as it looks in India, it still exists here. And I think that's something I fight about a lot with my parents when we're having discussions, is because it feels like such an improvement. There's this idea that classism doesn't really exist here. It does. And it can be just as ugly. It's just easy to never see it because it's not in the streets the same way it is, in the way it looks. It's my short version of it, but I think you probably
could. For me, I just, it's the same thing. It usually comes up in family. And I always tell my family that the best gift Nikhil, that's my husband, gave me was moving to the United States, because it was never my dream. But because I moved from being part of privilege and what would be equivalent to a white experience in India, to moving to a position, I'm still privileged because of education. I was triply selected. I'm not the same as the person who does not have the opportunity to go to school in rural India that I work with, right? That's not the same Indian that I am, that the United States then opened up with the Hart-Celler Act to allow me to come. They are definitely not opening the borders to get people from Orissa, where I work, where people have never had an opportunity to study. That, if you compare them with the African Americans who are systemically institutionalized, then it would be an apples to apples comparison. However difficult my story may have been, I may have come from poverty, I still am a privileged person coming from the group of Indians that came to the US. So for me to be part of the minority has actually helped me become more aware in spite of the privilege. I've not even faced a fraction of racism that most people do. But that's something that's really important for us as South Asians. And I'm a child born in privilege in a family where casteism was a big deal. And it's very hard to talk because everyone wants to say, it's not me, I don't do it, I help them, I help her. See, I look after the driver's family, or I take care of my house help. The whole problem is it's not about helping. I feel like there's a quote by Leela Watson. She's an Australian Aboriginal leader who said, if you are here to help me, you're wasting my time. But if you are here because your liberation is tied with my liberation, then let's work together. And I think that's something that we have to just embody and get inside of us, that none of us is really privileged until everyone is privileged. It always comes with a price that you pay.
Great points there. One question which is really interesting here, and I'll read it out. It says, I've been seeing very conservative social media posts by friends that I grew up in San Francisco who are first-generation immigrants of color, yet are posting anti-protest and other posts that racism doesn't exist. My immediate reaction is to stop following them or block them. What are your thoughts on how to have a conversation with them constructively?
Thank you.
I think this question goes on both sides of the bubble, right? I'm sure people on the other side of the bubble perhaps feel the same way. So how does one approach? You talked a lot about common ground. What's the first step you do towards achieving common ground?
First, actually, I wanted to suggest this book. If you haven't read it, I think now it's backwards. It just came out, See No Stranger.
Valerie Kaur
is and I'll put it in the follow-up. This just came out. I think this exactly, See No Stranger, and her words are so amazing about how do you love somebody who hates. And she had, I guess, right after September 11th, the first person who was killed in a hate crime, Babir Singh,
right,
was a close family friend of hers, uncle, for her, and her learning to love through that hate is chronicled in this journey. Mm-hmm. And I think the first thing we have to do is recognize our shared humanity. The minute you know that person's not a stranger for you, that there's something about them that you don't know, and to be curious about who they are and what their suffering is. It's not equal to my suffering, of course, but their suffering as well. You can connect with their shared humanity. I think you have to. That's the first step. What do we have to talk about? What do I not know about you? And what do you not know about me? Connect on that human level first before anything else. You cannot have a conversation around these really hard topics without connecting on that human level first. And having that conversation is your job. If you know them, it's your job. As a freedom fighter who has felt my life has been threatened because of the work I do, not because necessarily of my color, but because of the work I do. When I was arrested in Myanmar and sentenced to jail, certainly I felt like my life was on the line. Having those hard conversations will save someone's life. They really will. I might not have access to the person that could be the perpetrator of a hate crime, but you might. Have that hard conversation, get uncomfortable, do it. I think that there are times, of course, just block it. It's not worth it. You're not going to get through. I'm not saying never do that, but any moment that you can get through, try. My father is completely on the opposite political spectrum as I am, and I love him. And Dad, if you're listening, I think you're out there. I do, and that's the most important thing. So we can have those political discussions, and we fight and we yell, and we both will storm off at different times. But before anything else is that love. And he'll never admit that he's changed his mind a little bit because of me, and I probably wouldn't admit it either. But of course, he has. He can see why I fight for what I fight for, even if he doesn't agree with it, and that's enough. That's enough to stop.
But my personal viewpoint has been that it's more effective picking up the phone or face-to-face. I don't think I've changed any minds on social media in my entire life, ever. But, just doing that helps a lot. One last question we can take here, which is something to go with defunding the police discussion that we talked about. And Shrikant mentions that part of the issue is the perception of risk that the police force claims to feel. And while he's not condoning the police for 1 minute, do you think that gun control would help address part of the issue in terms of police brutality towards Black Americans? Is gun control tied to this?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, unequivocally, yes. I think that there's no other country that has the amount of death and gun violence as we do. I mean, none.
Yeah.
We regulate so many industries. Like, for instance, we have building inspectors for all of you structural engineers out there, not because we hate builders, but because we have to regulate the building industry. We have meat inspectors, not because I hate butchers, even though I'm vegetarian. It's because I want anyone who eats meat to be safe. And I think that's the same thing with police and having some type of, and gun control. Like, it's not that I hate you as a gun owner. We have to have some regulations. I don't know why gun owners have zero regulations and police departments have zero. I do not hate police officers. They need some type of laws and rules to make it safer. And
right. It's just interesting how all these issues are interconnected, aren't they, to get there. So the other question here, which was, I think, a pretty important question, perhaps most on this call can relate to, is this topic of affirmative action, right? Indian Americans in particular feel a little bit on the short end of the stick sometimes for the threshold that our children have to cross in order to get into the right Ivy League school or what have you. And many a times it's easy to sort of point blames at affirmative action, whether it's here or whether it's in India, where affirmative action is done on a pretty different scale altogether. What are your thoughts? I mean, is affirmative action still a valid framework to go forward with? If so, how long do we continue with affirmative action?
The people that benefit most from affirmative action, I have this conversation a lot. I think we should say that legacy children have benefited and still do have more spots in these Ivy Leagues than any type of affirmative action has ever done, which means that if you are a rich white male property owner at the beginning of this country, your children and their children have benefited from a form of affirmative action. It's the same thing when I hear about welfare, that actually the biggest beneficiaries of welfare are corporations who have been given breaks for a long, long time. But we have this perception that it's not real. You hear, and I think that has been a great talking point for a long time, that affirmative action is keeping white people out. That's just, the facts don't bear that. They don't.
Yeah.
It's important when you're reading a college essay, sure, this person, it makes sense. You have to look at the whole person. What did this person, to get a test score, an SAT score that's maybe 10 points lower than this person? You know, and you're looking at a person that's white and was raised in a rich neighborhood, and this person that's 10 point lower, they had to go to school with the pollution I was talking about. They had to ride a long bus there. They might have had to watch violence on their way there or been from a home from violence. Never had parents home, but still found their way to get to school and take that test at the end of 12 years of incredible abuse at the education system. That's not affirmative action. That's very, like, that is looking at a whole person. That person, I think, has a more likely, if you take a risk on that person, they are going to succeed, because they've already succeeded through tons more adversity than the person who had the easy, perfect life. To me, that's what affirmative action is like, we're going to look at the whole person, because some folks they're fighters, they're winners, they succeeded to get where they're at. And even if the test scores don't bear it out, you can bet that person's going to fight for everything to keep succeeding.
Yeah. Great. Sudnya, Nisha, let's bring this to a close with some good closing thoughts. Thank you so much. This was really an eye-opening conversation, and I hope this is just the beginning, right? I hope we continue these conversations, but more importantly, then also find the courage in our hearts to act. So Sudnya, Nisha, why don't you begin with some closing thoughts?
Nisha, would you like to say something before I conclude?
Sure. I had this John Lewis quote from his memoir that I wanted to end with. He said in his memoir, this is from 2017, and he said, "Freedom is not a state, it is an act. It is not some enchanted garden perched high on a distant plateau where we can finally sit down and rest. Freedom is the continuous action we all must take. Each generation must do its part to create an even more fair, more just society." So that's what I leave you with, for all of us in this generation and our next, to fight for freedom. And the slogan we say at my work all the time is, there's nothing more urgent than freedom. So thank you guys for having me. And I'm excited to share just a little piece of my world and what I do with you guys.
That's beautiful. Couldn't find a better way to end it. What I'm going to request our audience members is, while I conclude, if you could just put one word that you're left feeling, not thinking, not doing, how are you feeling right now as we finish this really hard conversation? I do think we all need to just take a deep breath. And it's a lot of stuff we are going to be processing, because this is only the beginning. It's only a conversation. And now we are going to act on it, and it's going to become part of our lives to the extent that we decide. So it would be lovely to check in with how you're feeling. In the meanwhile, what I wanted to say to Nisha is that it has been my absolute utmost privilege, thanks to Dimple reaching out to you, and you being you had no idea who we were, and you responded and gave us this amazing time and just sharing your lived experience, because for most of us, we are your father's generation, and it's our children who are living your lives and making choices like you are. This is the fabric of the United States that's growing by the day. And I'm inspired by your passion-filled and mission-based tireless work in facing and eradicating actually racism. I know these are lofty goals, but I think like you said, we have to reimagine. So we have to really dream, and then we have to find the common grounds to make the take little steps towards a progressive progress in that direction. So thank you. And for all of you listening in from all parts of the world, this is really, really special for all of us, because when we are in this together, we realize that this is a collective problem with a collective solution that impacts every one of us. No one person can be a hero. No one person can be a solution finder. We are all in this together. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nisha. Thank you, Sudnya. And just like everyone on the audience who are typing in their words, words like inspired, hopeful, determined, enlightened, I feel the same.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. And hope all of you have a great weekend. We'll continue these conversations. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.